Good morning. We've got some slides here all about this movement that marks a very significant period in early 19th century American literature, the Transcendentalists. Before we jump into this, though, I do hope that you've read through this short little PDF I posted immediately above this presentation called What is Transcendentalism? Read that first before you start this presentation. It can be difficult to define what exactly transcendentalism was and who the transcendentalists were. So uh, let's provide a few basic tenets of this period. Most people would agree that transcendentalism can be thought of as both a philosophical and literary movement that was centered in New England during the 19th century. It was an American movement, and it was also mostly associated with the Boston area. We can think of transcendentalism as a reaction against the rationalism that marked the 18th century Enlightenment and the Age of Reason. And for this reason, it's really the very heart of the American Romantic period. It relied heavily on intuition as the only way to comprehend reality in a world where every natural fact and every natural entity embodied a spiritual truth. So you can see how it's fundamentally different from the Age of Reason and the Enlightenment. Remember, the Enlightenment and the Age of Reason didn't care very much at all about emotions, intuition, and the imagination. This group of writers, this group of thinkers clearly do. One reason that I and so many others are drawn to the transcendentalist writers and the philosophy is because that at base it's a very idealistic philosophy. It's one that's marked by optimism and potential. It stresses the essential unity and interconnectedness of all things, which are ordered by a supreme mind, what Ralph Waldo Emerson would have called the oversoul. You can think of the oversoul as a collective consciousness of humanity. Emerson and the other transcendentalists believed truly in the divinity of man. And this allowed the transcendentalists to disregard external authority being civil law, religious dogma, and tradition, and what was considered traditionally to be uh, the inherited knowledge of the historic past. And they would set all of these things aside and perhaps, at the very least, secondary to the individual's direct experience. Trust thyself was Emerson's motto. And you can see this theme being celebrated in his poem, Each and All, and of course his essay, which we will read. If we have to read one essay of Emerson's, his landmark essay called Self-Reliance. The Transcendental Club was a very loose and informal collection of like-minded individuals, philosophers, writers, poets, social reformers, etc. And here is a good collection of some of the most representative voices of that movement: Henry David Thoreau, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Bronson Alcott, and Margaret Fuller. As I mentioned, the Transcendental Club was a group of like-minded individuals that held informal meetings beginning in 1836 in Concord, Massachusetts, in the home of the Reverend George Ripley. They'd come together to discuss the things that mattered to them the most: theology, philosophy, and literature. And I would add to this the social issues of their day, primarily the women's rights movement and the abolitionist movement. It's said that Emerson, Thoreau, Fuller, and Alcott's lofty discussions led neighbors to begin referring to the group as transcendentalists. In other words, this was a group of transcendental thinkers, those thinkers who were thinking above and beyond the material world, in the sort of lofty, abstract, philosophical realm. Emerson, though, would liken the transcendental term and the transcendental tag to the philosopher Immanuel Kant. This was, and it's important to remember this, a very loose and very informal association made up of extreme individuals. And so it was a very elastic membership. It wasn't a formal club or a formal association at all. It was just a group of people who came together. And to put this in perspective, we're talking about a group of probably no more than 2 or 3 dozen people throughout the Boston, Concord, Lexington, New England area. So this was not a widespread literary or philosophical movement. It's very small, very local, but the influence of this group was extraordinary indeed. In case anybody were to ever ask you on a quiz or an exam or anything like that, you might want to know that as a group, the Transcendental Club sponsored 2 major activities. First off, The Dial, which was a quarterly publication that was issued 16 times between the years 1840 and 1844. It was first edited by Margaret Fuller, followed by Emerson, and then finally with the assistance of Henry David Thoreau. Its subscription list was always small from the beginning. It dwindled and ultimately caused its demise. The second major activity that this group undertook was what was known as Brook Farm, established in 1841. It was, in its intentional design and beginnings, a utopian community, an agrarian farm, if you will, that would allow its members to live there on this farm and pursue their own self-realization, whatever that looked like for one another. But it was to be an agrarian model where each people came together, they worked the land, they farmed, um, they had livestock, they lived together, they worked together, and then in the evenings they would have conversations, they would have um, long discussions about, and again, any variety of topic that dealt with those things that they found the most interesting. It's interesting to note, well, let me say this, that the utopian community, as most of them do, often fail. And a number of problems caused this to fail. There was certainly a fire that destroyed the main building. That certainly put the brakes on the experiment. But I would also add that, as is so often the case, human self-ego and pride also caused Brook Farm to come to its termination. Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom you've heard of because he wrote the Scarlet Letter, probably you've heard of him. One of his novels was called The Blithedale Romance. And in the Blithedale Romance, Nathaniel Hawthorne satirizes the Brook Farm experiment and the Transcendentalists group and their attempt at a utopian community. Nathaniel Hawthorne was no transcendentalist, okay? And we'll talk more about how Melville and Nathaniel Hawthorne, again, two other great romantic writers of this period, were very, very much different than um, the Transcendentalists. And we'll talk more about that in the weeks ahead. So, Transcendentalism and this small group of Transcendentalist writers and thinkers energize what is already a very lively movement, this period that we're in right now, known as the Romantic period. And transcendentalist thought and transcendentalism ideology influences really all the major authors after 1840 in the 19th century. It inspired many writers to greatness, and here I'm thinking primarily of people like Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, but it inspired writers who disagreed to one degree or the other with many transcendental theories and concepts. I mentioned this just a moment ago in the previous slide. Nathaniel Hawthorne and Herman Melville, again, two of probably the greatest American writers of the 19th century, prose fiction writers, um, uh, are romantic writers, but they certainly were not transcendentalists. Because remember, transcendentalists have an idealistic philosophy. They believe in the innate goodness and in the innate divinity of man. And Melville and Hawthorne uh, did not. Okay, they were what we would really call dark romantics, and I would lump Edgar Allan Poe in with Hawthorne and Melville, who viewed the human condition and human experience, and certainly in their writing did. They treated the experience with a romantic impulse, but it was not a very optimistic uh, type of fiction that Poe, that Melville, that Hawthorne wrote. It's marked with the shadings and shadows of the supernatural, of the darkness that human beings are capable of. So we would think of Poe, Melville, and Hawthorne as dark romantics. Okay, you need to remember that, as opposed to light romantics. Light romantics are people like William Cullen Bryant, people like Thoreau, people like Emerson, people like Walt Whitman, Alcott, etc. So we'll run through some characteristics of transcendentalism. The importance of the individual's intuition cannot be overstated. Okay, and we will study this in much greater detail in Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance. But think of this, intuition is important. Also, their anti-authoritarianism. To know what is right, I need not ask what is the current practice, or what says the revised statutes, or what say holy men of old, but what says conscience? What does God say? This statement by Theodore Parker illustrates the anti-authoritarian streak that is so wide in these transcendentalist thoughts. They didn't care what traditional authoritative voices had written, had said, or believed. Emerson will say in Self-Reliance, in fact, what I must do is all that concerns me, not what people think. So right along with this anti-authoritarian streak is their healthy contempt for the past. And we see this in a lot of their writings. If you pay attention, you will detect them in their writings, in their utterances, dismissing or disparaging the past, what the previous generation held or privileged to be important or valid. And we see it in two of Emerson's essays that we don't have time to study, but in The American Scholar and also in the Divinity School Address. Another characteristic of Transcendentalism is their love of nature. And they share this, of course, with the whole Romantic movement, in generally speaking. We see the Transcendentalists extolling the virtues of nature in Emerson's first really important piece of writing that he published in 1836, which was called Nature. It's in your textbook. And if you read the first 2 pages of that, you will see Emerson truly celebrating and really the intoxicating vivaciousness, regenerative, restorative powers of interacting with the natural world. You also see it in Henry David Thoreau's landmark piece, Walden, published first in 1854. We'll read some excerpts from Thoreau's Walden in a week or so. The Transcendentalists were men and women of action. As such, one of the key characteristics of Transcendentalism was their profound interest and dedication to social reform. People like Margaret Fuller, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Bronson Alcott, his daughter Louisa May Alcott, you may be familiar with. She wrote Little Women, which is now, I think, they've just done a new movie of. But the Transcendentalists supported the causes of their day: educational reform, women's rights, the abolitionist movement. They were worried about the criminal justice system. They were worried about mental health issues, about those people with mental health and how they were treated in asylums and so forth. Another chief characteristic of this group was that they were searching and deeply committed to developing, establishing a national literature that possessed it should be an organic form. And we can see this in Emerson's essay, The Poet. Emerson, you keep hearing this name over and over again in these slides. Emerson was the central figure of American literature in the 19th century. He was, for all intents and purposes, the Bill Gates, the Elvis Presley, however you want to think about him. He was this Gibraltar figure. He was this enormous, they called him the Sage of Concord. He was known worldwide for his lectures, for his writings, for his poetry, for what he did to inspire this group of writers and to help create what becomes American literature. Individualism and transcendentalism. Most transcendentalists believe that an individual's relationship with the divine, with God, was extraordinarily intimate, individual, and personal, and was to be established directly by the individual and not at all through the intermediation of church ritual. We'll talk more about this when we get to Emerson. Emerson himself was an ordained Unitarian minister, and he looked and felt and lamented, really, that the church, the New England church, had grown cold, had grown sterile, had grown lackluster in its fervor for celebrating the divine. Ultimately, Emerson leaves the ministry. And in a famous, actually in the letter that he wrote to his congregation, he wrote, "In order to be a good minister, I have to leave the ministry." If you want to see why Ralph Waldo Emerson was banned from speaking at Harvard University for 30, 40 years, I think it was, you need to read the Divinity School address, which he delivered there in Cambridge at Harvard as he was addressing the commencement or the graduation ceremony of its divinity school. And in this address, he he upset the status quo and the Illuminati who were there, the distinguished professors, the distinguished statesmen of Boston, for his radical, or at least perceived by them to be radical, utterances about the state of organized religion, and really what was the call and the ultimate mission of individuals entering into the priesthood. The Transcendentalists also believed in the dignity of the common person and of common labor. And again, the best expression of transcendentalist individualism is Emerson's essay, Self-Reliance. Who were the Transcendentalists? As I mentioned a few slides ago, they were not a big group. And again, maybe 2 dozen, maybe 3 dozen would self-identify as Transcendentalists in their day. Chief among these, though, were people like Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Alcott, Margaret Fuller, Ellery Channing. We're not going to read all of these in the class. We're going to read 3 of them. We're going to read Emerson, we're going to read Thoreau, and we're going to read Margaret Fuller. Here's a picture of the man himself. I like to call or refer to him as the Big E. You can see he lived almost the entire 19th century. As I mentioned, was descended from really a long line of Unitarian ministers. He was a poet, an essayist, a lecturer. He founded the Transcendental Club, very popular lecturer. He was banned from his alma mater. He was banned from Harvard for 40 years following his divinity school address. And he was a staunch supporter of the abolitionist movement. Henry David Thoreau, 1817 to 1862, was very much a student of Emerson's. Emerson really was Thoreau's mentor, philosophically, artistically. Thoreau would go to Harvard. He would graduate. He became a school teacher. He was an essayist, a poet, but he's most famous really for 2 works, 2 principal works. 1854, he publishes Walden, which chronicles the 2 years and the 2 months and 2 days that he spent living in a cabin that he built with his own hands in the woods. He would also be known for civil disobedience. He influenced the environmental movement. Many point to him really as America's first true naturalist, America's first environmentalist, and he too was a staunch supporter of the abolitionist movement. I found that not many people are too familiar with Bronson Alcott, but I will venture to say after this slide, you will see that you do owe a great debt of gratitude. We all do to Bronson Alcott. You can see his dates. He's contemporaneous with people like Emerson, Thoreau, and this Transcendentalist movement. He's most known for being an educational reformer, for his role as teacher and writer. He founded several schools in Boston, innovative, radical, highly unorthodox, and unconventional in his educational practices. Bronson Alcott uh, argued and ultimately introduced into the curriculum art, music, physical education, uh, the study of nature, the concept of taking students into the field and outside of the classroom for field trips. He would banish corporal punishment in his schools. He did not see that as an effective means of discipline. So too with Henry David Thoreau. In fact, Thoreau resigned his first position as a teacher after he had graduated college because the leaders of this school, um, the governing board of the school, required its teachers to uh, impose corporal punishment for behavioral issues. He would have to whip the students. He did it once, and he became so violently ill after it and so emotionally distraught that he immediately resigned his position, said that he could not and that he would not whip students. Alcott was the father of celebrated novelist Louisa May Alcott, as I mentioned in the previous slide. So you may be more familiar with Louisa May Alcott than you are her father Bronson. Margaret Fuller was a transcendentalist, intellectual, journalist, critic, women's rights activist, lived from 1810 to 1850. Her life tragically cut quite short. We'll talk more about that later when we get to her. She was the first editor of The Dial, and if you recall, this was the Transcendentalist journal that was published quarterly for 4 years. She was the first female journalist to work on a major newspaper, the New York Tribune. She also taught at Bronson Alcott's Temple School. Margaret Fuller is most known, however, for her work, Woman of the 19th Century. And we will read excerpts from that in a few weeks. Margaret Fuller, one of the very first and certainly one of the most significant early voices in the women's rights movement. We'll throw Ellery Channing in, at least his name, and a nice little picture of him here to close our discussion of the Transcendentalists. Channing was a poet of the day, although we don't see his work anthologized very much. But he was very much a significant individual and significant voice of this group known as the Transcendentalists. He was an especially close friend of Henry David Thoreau's. And after Henry David Thoreau died, It was Ellery Channing who published the first biography of Thoreau in 1873. It was called Thoreau, the Poet Naturalist. There are a lot of great resources out there on the Transcendentalists. I've listed three for you here in the event that you want to do some additional reading and research on this unique and rather significant, albeit them small, group of writers.